The air inside the grand hall of the Galactic Council was thick with self-importance, a suffocating mix of arrogance and ancient bureaucracy. The vaulted ceiling, lined with crystalline domes, refracted the glow of 100 different species, their bioluminescence, metallic sheens, or shifting hues creating a dizzying kaleidoscope of alien superiority. And yet, amidst the grandeur, 5 humans sat in silence. Elias Young, chief negotiator of the United Terran Assembly, smoothed the crease of his dark blue diplomatic jacket, a gesture so small it almost went unnoticed. His face betrayed nothing, calm, unreadable, and patient. Beside him, Olivia Reyes leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers tapping an almost imperceptible rhythm against the data pad on her lap. The others, analysts, military advisors, trade officials, watched and waited. Across the room, at the highest seat of the Council's circular assembly, High Chancellor Vorkon spread his arms wide, his robes of interwoven gold shimmering in the artificial starlight. His voice, smooth and honeyed, dripped with condescension. "Humanity's progress has been admirable," he said, pausing for effect, as though bestowing a rare compliment upon a particularly intelligent pet. "In mere millennia, you have stumbled your way from primitive to the stars. A commendable effort, truly." Elias remained still. The only movement was the slow rise of his chest as he exhaled, measured, and controlled. Vorkon's lips curled. "It is with great generosity that this council extends an offer. Observer status, Class 2. He gestured to the gathered ambassadors. A sea of approving nods and murmured agreement. "You will be allowed restricted trade within approved networks, limited oversight on interstellar policies, and, of course, guidance from civilizations far older, far wiser than your own. The kind of silence that stretches, that presses against the walls of the room like a storm waiting to break." Olivia's eyes flicked to Elias. A single look, an entire conversation exchanged. And then, Elias Young smiled. It wasn't a broad smile, nor one of gratitude. No, it was the kind of smile that made diplomats sweat and military tacticians reach for their contingency plans. A smile that knew something no one else in the room did. "I see," and his voice was quiet, almost pleasant. "Just to clarify, your offer requires us to submit our technological developments for council approval before implementation." "Naturally," Vorkon replied smoothly. "It is for your own protection. Young species often lack the wisdom to properly manage advanced." "And our trade routes?" Elias interrupted, his tone still impossibly polite. Vorkon blinked. "All economic ventures must, of course, be properly sanctioned through the Council's regulatory branches." "And the treaties we've formed with independent species outside your jurisdiction?" A pause. It was small, barely perceptible, but Elias caught it. Vorkon's smile tightened. "Such agreements would need to be renegotiated under Council supervision to ensure compliance." Then, Olivia Reyes exhaled, leaned forward, and laughed. "I'm sorry," she said, still grinning. "I was wondering how long it would take before someone tried this old playbook on us." Confusion flickered across the faces of the assembled dignitaries. Vorkon's bioluminescent patches pulsed erratically. "This is a generous offer, Commander Reyes." Elias stood, smooth, effortless, like a chess player executing a move that had been decided 10 turns ago. "We appreciate your time," he said, reaching for his data pad, gathering his things with the deliberate ease of someone completely unconcerned. Vorkon frowned. "I don't believe you understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Elias adjusted his cuffs and lanced once at Olivia, who was already rising to follow him. "Humanity formally declines your offer. Effective immediately. We withdraw from these negotiations." A ripple of stunned silence swept through the chamber, followed by a cacophony of raised voices. "You can't simply... This is an outrage." "The Council does not tolerate such defiance." Vorkon's expression twisted. "You would be wise to reconsider, Ambassador Young." For the first time, Elias let something flash in his eyes. A spark, just a flicker, but enough. "I think," he said softly, "you should be very careful about who you think is in control here." And then, without another word, humanity turned and walked away. Behind them, the Galactic Council fell into chaos. As the heavy doors of the Grand Hall sealed shut behind them, the muffled roar of panicked voices echoed in their wake. Olivia Reyes let out a slow breath. rolling her shoulders like a fighter walking out of the ring after a flawless knockout. She cast a sidelong glance at Elias Young, who walked beside her with the same unshaken calm he had held inside that chamber. Well, she mused, tucking her data pad under her arm. That went well. Elias chuckled, the sound low and amused. Did it? Oh, absolutely, Olivia smirked. I mean, did you hear that guy? Young species often lack wisdom. She mimicked Vorkon's pompous tone. I swear, I thought he was going to pat us on the head and give us a gold star for trying. They entered the diplomatic transport bay, where their shuttle awaited. The sleek, gunmetal gray ship bore no markings, no flags, just a simple, unassuming vessel, small enough to be overlooked, which was precisely the point. Elias climbed the ramp, tapping his earpiece. Control, we're on our way back. Status update? A voice crackled through the line. Decker, their chief communications officer. You've got a problem. Elias stopped halfway up the ramp. Define problem. Bad. There's a council blockade forming outside the Nexus jump gate. Olivia cursed under her breath. They're trying to box us in. Not just that, Decker continued. They've frozen all outgoing diplomatic traffic. No ships are getting clearance to leave. Officially. They're calling it a security review. Unofficially. They're scrambling. Elias exhaled through his nose. He had expected resistance, of course. He had, but this was fast. Faster than anticipated. That meant two things. First, the council had realized just how badly they had miscalculated. And second, they were afraid. He turned back toward Olivia, who was already bringing up a holographic display of the blockade layout on her wrist terminal. Red-marked ships, council patrol craft, were tightening their formation, creating a web of interdiction points between them and open space. They're going to try and force us back to the negotiating table, Olivia muttered. Or worse. Elias tilted his head slightly. Do we have a countermeasure? Olivia grinned, the kind of grin that made opposing generals lose sleep. I thought you'd never ask. With a flick of her wrist, she transmitted new orders to their ship's pilot. A second later, the shuttle's engines came online. But instead of the usual startup sequence, the thrusters pulsed in an irregular pattern, a coded signal. From the far side of the diplomatic bay, another ship powered up. Unlike their own shuttle, this one was not unassuming. The Resolve was a human vessel built for one purpose, making people rethink their life choices. It wasn't the largest ship in the fleet, nor the most heavily armed, but it was fast, nimble, and carried an advanced electronic warfare suite that could turn any blockade into a tangle of blind, helpless ships. Decker's voice came through again, laced with barely contained amusement. Bringing the Resolve online now. Want me to ask the council politely to move, or are we past that point? Elias smiled, adjusting his cuffs. Oh, we're way past that point. The Resolve lifted from its docking clamps, hovering like a predator poised to strike. The moment it cleared the bay, its electronic warfare systems engaged, sending out a carefully tailored burst of false signals and decoy transmissions. Out in orbit, the council blockade faltered, ships turned erratically, and their navigation systems flooded with conflicting data. Others reported non-existent engine malfunctions. Inside the Grand Hall, where council members were still scrambling to salvage their crumbling authority, emergency alerts began flashing across their data terminals. Sir, one of Vorkon's aides gasped. The humans. I know, Vorkon snarled, watching in horror as the Resolve wove through the blockade like a thread through cloth, passing through gaps that had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. By the time the council ships corrected their sensors, the humans were gone. Back aboard the Resolve, Olivia leaned back in her seat, arms crossed behind her head. Well, she said, grinning at Elias. That went even better. Elias simply nodded, gazing at the fading glow of the Nexus station in the distance. And now, he murmured, the real game begins. The Resolve cut through the darkness of space like a whisper, its engines humming with controlled power. The moment they broke free from the blockade, Olivia Reyes let out a sharp breath, rolling her neck to release the tension coiled there. Decker's voice came through the comms, laced with the dry amusement of someone who had just outplayed an opponent and knew it. Well, that was fun. So, what's next? Are we sending the council a thank you card for their hospitality? Elias Young didn't answer immediately. He was staring out at the vastness beyond the viewport, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. His mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating moves, counter moves, the inevitable retaliation. The question wasn't if they would strike back, it was how soon. Then, as if summoned by his thoughts, an alert flashed across the ship's primary console. Decker said, "We've got incoming. High-priority transmission. Scrambling codes, but it's coming through all major channels." The main display flickered to life, revealing the unmistakable form of High Chancellor Vorkon. His bioluminescent patterns pulsed erratically, but his voice, when it came, was carefully measured, a mask of authority over the panic lurking beneath. "To the representatives of the United Terran Assembly," he began, each word dripping with forced composure. "Your reckless defiance has placed you in direct violation of intergalactic protocol. This council has tolerated this long enough." And he straightened, his gaze dark and unwavering. "As of this moment, all Terran trade agreements under council jurisdiction are hereby suspended. Any species found engaging in unauthorized commerce with your kind will face severe sanctions." Olivia let out a low whistle. Well, that escalated quickly. Elias didn't react. He simply leaned forward, fingers tapping absently against the console, watching Vorkon's performance with the keen eyes of a predator observing its prey. He had expected this, of course. Cutting humanity off from council-regulated trade was the most predictable move in their playbook, an attempt to starve them into submission. But what the council had failed to realize, what they had never bothered to consider, was that humanity had spent the last decade preparing for this exact scenario. "Shall I respond?" Decker asked, his tone light, but his fingers were already poised over the comm controls. Elias finally smiled. "No need. Let them sit with it." He turned to Olivia. "Activate Phase 1. Without hesitation, Olivia keyed in a command on her terminal. Across the vast reaches of space, an invisible pulse rippled outward, a single, encrypted signal carrying a message to those who had been waiting for it. Within hours, trade stations at the fringes of council-controlled space flickered to life with new activity. Ships that had once flown under council banners now moved with different insignias, carrying cargo meant for destinations that no longer required council approval. Merchants, traders, and industrialists, many of whom had long chafed under the bureaucracy of the Galactic Council, suddenly found themselves with a choice, and they chose humanity. Because what the Council had never understood, what they had dismissed as irrelevant, was the simple fact that human trade agreements weren't just trade agreements. They were partnerships, friendships. Mutual investments are built not on coercion, but on trust. The Council had ruled with fear. Humanity had built something stronger. Vorkon must have realized it within hours, because the next transmission came far sooner than expected. His image flickered back onto their screen, but this time, the fury in his eyes was barely concealed. "You think you can operate outside the Council's authority?" His voice was sharp, a blade wrapped in silk. "You believe these alliances will last? They will abandon you the moment it becomes inconvenient." Elias only tilted his head slightly, his smile never wavering. "You seem worried, Chancellor." Vorkon's jaw tightened. "Understand this. Young, if you continue down this path, you will make enemies you cannot afford to make." Elias leaned forward, his gaze steady. "And if we continue down this path, you will lose control over something you cannot afford to lose." The silence that followed was telling. The Council had always relied on the assumption that the galaxy needed them, that without their oversight, chaos would reign. But what if that assumption was wrong? What if order didn't come from control, but from cooperation? What if the Council wasn't as indispensable as they had always believed? Vorkon cut the transmission abruptly, but the damage was already done. Decker let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I think you just made history." Elias exhaled, finally leaning back in his chair. "No, Decker, we just started history, because for the first time in centuries, the Council was afraid." Moments settled into the chamber, an inescapable reality sinking into the minds of every delegate present. The Council wasn't just losing control, they had already lost it. Then, Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out a single data pad. He placed it carefully on the central negotiation table. "This," he said, "is a proposal." Vorkon's voice was barely above a whisper. "A proposal?" Elias nodded. "A path forward, not for us. We're doing just fine, but for you." The Council leader hesitated, then slowly, almost unwillingly, reached for the pad. As he scanned the contents, his eyes widened, his fury momentarily replaced by disbelief. A reformation of the Galactic Council into something new, something based on cooperation rather than coercion. A model where every species had a voice, where trade and governance were driven by collaboration rather than fear. Vorkan looked up sharply. "You're offering us equality?" Elias's smile didn't waver. "I'm offering you a future." The chamber fell into an unnatural stillness, because for the first time, the council wasn't dictating the terms. They were being given a choice, and they had never been more afraid. For a long, stretched moment, silence filled the grand hall. Not the diplomatic silence of controlled conversations, nor the weighty pause before a negotiation resumed. No, this was something different. It was the silence of an empire realizing it was no longer an empire. The silence of an old order staring into its own irrelevance. High Chancellor Vorkan's bioluminescence had dimmed to a dull, uneasy flicker. His eyes flicked between Elias Young and the proposal on the datapad, his mind desperately trying to calculate a way out, a path where the council remained in power. But there was none. Elias stood, hands folded behind his back, waiting. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't rushing. He simply let the weight of reality settle, let them process what had already been decided, whether they liked it or not. The room was changing. Murmurs between delegates had taken on a new tone, not of fear, but of consideration. Representatives from species long sidelined by the council whispered in hushed excitement. The Proximan delegation, which had always towed the line of council authority, exchanged glances before one of them subtly nodded. The Centauri ambassador leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming with something that looked dangerously close to hope. Vorkan turned his gaze back to Elias, his fury simmering beneath the surface. But there was something else now, a reluctant recognition. His voice, when it finally came, was measured but heavy. "And if we refuse?" Elias tilted his head slightly, considering. Then, with infuriating calm, he simply said, "You won't." Vorkan inhaled sharply, his tendrils twitching in restrained frustration. Elias let the silence drag just long enough before he continued, his voice steady. "Let's be clear about what's happening here, Chancellor. You don't have to accept this. The council can reject the proposal. You can dig your heels in and pretend that nothing has changed." He took a slow step forward, his presence filling the space between them. "But then what?" And his voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of inevitability. "Trade has already shifted. Commerce is flowing without you. Your allies are questioning their allegiance. Your words don't hold the power they once did. The galaxy is already moving forward. The only question is whether you move with it." Vorkan's fingers tightened around the edges of the datapad, his grip the only thing betraying the war raging inside him. His pride demanded defiance. His logic demanded surrender. And then, slowly, deliberately, he exhaled. His shoulders, usually held high with regal certainty, slumped ever so slightly. "Call a vote," he muttered. A stunned pause swept across the chamber. Then, with a series of hurried taps on their consoles, representatives from across the galaxy began casting their decisions. The vote tally appeared on the central holo display. Elias watched as the numbers solidified. Nearly 80% are in favor. The council, as it had once existed, was no more. Olivia Reyes let out a breath, leaning slightly toward him. "Well," she murmured, "we actually did it." Elias's lips twitched. "Of course we did." The Proximan ambassador stood, adjusting the ceremonial pins on his robes. "Then it is decided," he announced, his voice steadier than Vorkan's had been. "The Galactic Council will be dissolved and restructured under the principles of equal representation and shared governance. Trade regulations will be rewritten under a cooperative economic model." He glanced at Elias, something unreadable flickering in his many eyes. "Effective immediately." The declaration settled into the room like a shift in gravity, the end of an era, the birth of something new. Vorkan let out a slow, measured breath. Then, to the shock of nearly everyone present, he turned his gaze to Elias and gave the smallest, most imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Later, much later, Elias and Olivia sat in the quiet hum of the Resolve, gazing out at the stars as their ship drifted through the vastness of space. "Well," Olivia mused, swirling the whiskey in her glass, "we just rewrote the structure of galactic governance over the course of a few weeks. You think they'll put that in the history books?" Elias smiled, stretching out comfortably in his chair. "Oh, absolutely." A pause settled between them. the weight of everything they had just accomplished lingering in the air. Then Olivia raised her glass in an easy toast. To the future. Elias clinked his glass against hers. To humanity. Outside, the galaxy turned, and for the first time in history, it turned on their terms.